Recording.
So, hi all, it's Natia and Tony, and we will discuss today's strengths and weaknesses of the psychodynamic approach. First of all, let me discuss a bit what is. Could you move, Tony, to the next slide? Just very briefly to discuss what psychodynamic talks about actually, and why it's important for the conflict analysis and resolution. Psychodynamic or psychoanalysis stresses unconscious mental life, memories, dreams, and other long forgotten remnants of earlier conflicts and frustrations. And psychoanalysis is important for conflict analysis and resolution because it can provide useful tools to analyze individual and or group dynamic and relationships through unconscious cognition, unconscious motivation, symbolism in behavior, or also fixation with past traumas. But psychodynamic approach has also its limitation. It's just where it presence and or absence of the unconscious. It's actually very hard to prove directly, and also this is very challenging approach methodology wise. For example, the data collection, analysis, and generalization, which is important for the conflict analysis process, and it's also difficult to bridge the gap between individual and institutional level changes, but I think it's also pretty visible in other theories from psychology. Now you can move to the next slide. I will bring two examples from Georgian Abkhaz case or context, as I usually discuss during this lecture. Psychodynamic or analysis is important in Georgian Abkhaz context for two particular reasons. It's very useful to understand the importance of symbols. Both Georgian and Abkhaz societies are very much affected by symbols, and they are very sensitive also towards them. For example, in Georgian literature, there is a story about Abkhaz men, and I also studied this when I was at school. And this is, it's called Hagiatzba. This is the man's name, and he is portrayed as wise, very honest, very trusted person. And I think this helps Georgian Georgian society to have sometimes really unconsciously this positive attitude or positive attribution towards Abkhazians or certain characteristics about them. And sometimes these symbols also bring these two divided societies back together in very unexpected circumstances or settings. And on the other hand, psychoanalysis or psychodynamic is very useful in this context to understand importance of defense mechanisms. Particularly, I found it very useful to explain behavior of the young generations in both sides. For example, this projection and derationalization that is part of the psychoanalysis. It's very visible in Georgian and in Abkhaz young people when they, and in this case, even though they do not have this past experience of knowing each other or living in one society, they still have very strong attributions or very strong understanding about each other. They for example, ascribe certain characteristics about each other, and they always find to try to find this strong logic or justification of their understanding or about each other. And the another example that I wanted to discuss is the internally displaced people. And you can move to the next slide, Tony. Internally, this psychoanalysis, psychodynamic approach is very useful to understand why internally displaced people in Georgian society is out of this confidence building or dialogue process. Because from the research and also from my experience of working with internally displaced people, we can say that absolute majority of them are, they cannot find fixation with past trauma. They are very vulnerable towards this experience, and they experience denial, they experience repression. They really struggle to live with this current reality, and also they really experience this anxiety, and sometimes because their psychological state is not adequately dealt with, or it's not actually seriously taken into consideration at the same time, because the only support for them was the shelter and the humanitarian assistance, and nobody really considered importance of their psychological well-being. And they are not part of the dialogue and confidence building activities. They are really missed from these processes, and sometimes, not sometimes actually, quite often, the explanation is that they are very aggressive people and they act destructively during this dialogue process, and that's why they are not part of this. And I think that happens because their psychological well-being is not taken care of, and the limitation of the psychoanalysis, not only I think in this context or analysis of this context, is really how to really make a connection between these individual changes into the group changes. And now I will stop here and give a floor to Tony to continue with her examples.
Thank you, Nadia. That is very interesting. I think it can be very, very difficult if you're not already embedded in one of these conflicts to understand the psychodynamic underpinnings of what's happening. I chose one that's part of Texas culture here where I live. It is kind of reflected in Balkans traumas and glories, but it's easiest to understand if I say that our secession from the Union had this very strong law and order language. And so in our narrative here, we have a very strong connection between civil rights and the anxiety associated with those, and the counter argument to that is law and order. So sometimes it's hard to see where that psychodynamic component comes in, but I'm going to try and make an argument that shows how all of these theories are actually helpful to understand what happens in the Black Lives Movement or All Lives Movement. So here you see part of a diary from Reverend Nicholas Davis, and he's talking about one of the chosen traumas of the South, that there was a time of unexampled prosperity, and all at once it stopped because of the end of slavery, and that law and order disappeared. So you can start to see the beginning of this kind of language. So if we look at Freud's theories, we can see that there's a projection of that fear that there's going to be violence, there's repression, rationalization of slavery, some denial. So all of these defense mechanisms are making it into the language that's still kind of ongoing today. From Jung, we get that there is a collective unconscious in both groups, and that they consider it to be an ancient and archetypal hatred, as well as elevating their heroes to that kind of status. I really think that Erikson has a lot to contribute, because he acknowledged that there are all these signifiers of group identity, and you can really see that in the South with the Confederate flag, and also with Black Lives Matter movement, where they have the fist. These competing symbols are captured even and get kind of wrapped up in our law enforcement because of this law and order language. So it's not surprising that there's now a conflict between the police, who have traditionally been an enforcing mechanism for the South, that has always resisted kind of desegregation and civil rights in the South. I also like to address Erikson's ideas on dehumanization. I think that there is, even though there are limits to psychodynamic theory because you really can't prove what the subconscious is, I think he really is onto something. David Livingston Smith kind of builds on his ideas and says it's not just dehumanization, that sometimes people are considered to be human and unhuman at the same time. And I think that there may be some neurological underpinnings that cause a lot of anxiety and aggression, going back to Freud, from this dynamic of seeing people as dehumanized. And we definitely have seen that in the South today in the conflict that we're having. And I think maybe as we go forward from a more scientific perspective, that neurology is going to back up some of these psychodynamic ideas. From, we can see that there are some aggressive personality types and attempts to escape from freedom by moving together and kind of lifting up a leader, an aggressive leader, and taking shelter in that. I think that's a big part of what's going on right now in our politics. I think Trump is a very strong leader, and in many ways people are infantilizing themselves into both movements for simplification from like a modern anxiety type of idea. And then most useful, I think, is Vulcan. We can see that the chosen glories and chosen traumas of this conflict are mirror images of each other. I would say that slavery and the end of the Civil War are both chosen glories and traumas going back that are building on this conflict that we're having today. And I can see how law enforcement are the heroes for the All Lives Matter movement, and they are holding up the tent pole for their group, and that there is a civil rights movement that's under a separate tent. They have their own tent pole, and that people are using all of these psychodynamic tools of denial and are suffering from anxiety, and that this is what's really building on this conflict. So I think these concepts are really useful to understand individual repression of events that are happening as they unfold that are harmful to the group. And they're, like we talked about earlier in the course, they're using selective perception, errors of attribution, and stereotyping as part of those defensive mechanisms. And I think it's really useful to understand the aggressive nature of the leaders that kind of emerge in this environment and the submissive nature of followers. I think it's also useful to understand that there's some transference and countertransference between the leaders and their groups, as the leaders are considered heroes and expected to create security. They have, they take on the expectations of the group and are acting in that way. And then likewise, they present kind of the need for security onto the group as well. I think the inadequacy of psychodynamic theories is kind of an inaccessibility to a solution or an approach to change the underlying subconscious of individuals or groups. I haven't really seen in our study or really our field a really concrete way to change the underlying motivations of people once they get wrapped up in this polarization or anxiety dynamic. And of course, we all have to have references. I enjoyed working with Natia very much. I appreciate everybody's attention and interest in these topics. I'm looking forward to the rest of the semester with everyone.